Name me one villain more iconic than Darth Vader. When Mr. Respirator first walked onto our screens, he was as mysterious as he was terrifying. But the more we've seen of old Darth, the better we've gotten to know him. From his stint as a cute boy racer to his teenage emo phase. These days, well, maybe we've seen too much. While it's great to flesh out a character and explore them in more depth, are there times when doing so can make them worse rather than better? To find out, let's dig into the storytelling tricks that made Darth Vader so iconic in the first place, and look at the rules for unveiling a character's backstory to determine what parts of Vader's portrayal worked and what didn't. You've probably heard this one before, and it's a core principle of good storytelling. Don't waste time explaining things to the audience when you could dramatize that information instead. Why tell me that your character is a scoundrel when you could just show him blasting people in the face?
Sorry about the mess.
The original Star Wars movie is a masterclass in show don't tell, right from the opening shot of that rebel ship fleeing an Imperial cruiser. We're not bogged down in detail about the Empire and the rebels. Everything we need to know is conveyed in that image. A small, lone ship, hopelessly outgunned by a superior force. The same is true of Darth Vader. This bad lad struts onto the ship with his mask and his cloak and his scary breathing. Immediately, he's a sinister presence. We get no context about who he is, only that he's in charge, he's angry, and he wants those Death Star plans.
Commander, tear this ship apart until you found those plans and bring me the passengers. I want them alive!
Introducing a character like this forces the audience to engage with the story. They ask questions like, what's behind the mask? Why is he breathing like that? How come he's wearing more PVC than the crowd at a fetish night? There's an unspoken promise that all, or at least some, of these questions will be answered if the audience keeps watching. But while the promise of answers can keep people hooked to a story, actually revealing those answers might not be the smartest move. Because more often than not, backstory is something that's told rather than something that's shown, and too much telling can really hurt the pace of a story. Which is why the original trilogy is ruthlessly efficient in how little it tells the audience. Vader does have some fantastic backstory, but we don't learn much of it right away. So why not? When does more information score, and when does it bore? Broadly speaking, if you're revealing a character's backstory, it should do two things: impact the plot and impact the audience. Information impacts the plot when it creates conflict, increases stakes, explains a character's motivation, or sets up a future plot point, like an obstacle or a solution. For example, see how the story is impacted when Obi-Wan tells Luke that he trained Darth Vader, and that Darth Vader went on to betray the Jedi and murdered them all, including Luke's father. This backstory creates conflict between Luke and Vader. He's not just the bad man looking for the Death Star plans anymore. Now, it's personal. It also increases the stakes and fleshes out Vader's motivation, since being part of the dark side of the Force means Vader is fundamentally opposed to Luke and Obi-Wan. Even without the Death Star plans, he'll always have a reason to come after them. Plus, it sets up their confrontation later in the film. Since Vader betrayed Obi-Wan, it makes sense that the two of them would come to blows and that Obi-Wan would outsmart his former pupil. This part of Vader's backstory impacts the audience as well. And that's important, because story doesn't matter unless it makes people feel something. Information impacts the audience when it reveals character, making us like or dislike someone, when it resonates with the story's main themes, if it's surprising or unexpected, or if it's cool as fuck. This part of Vader's backstory makes us sympathize with Luke and Obi-Wan, and dislike Vader for betraying the Jedi and going on a murderous rampage. Plus, finding out that Vader single-handedly wiped out all the other space wizards is definitely cool as fuck. But the really important part here, which we'll come back to later, is that what we're told in this backstory matches up with what we've been shown about Vader so far. He clearly is a ruthless and efficient dude, so it makes sense that he did all of this. And if we're in any doubt, the very next scene shows Vader nearly killing a guy for suggesting the Force isn't all that it's cracked up to be.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Now that we've covered the rules, let's look at perhaps the most famous part of Vader's backstory to understand why it works so well.
No.
I am your father.
Oh, wait, no, you're right.
There's a reason why this twist has been parodied to death. That's fucking cool. It creates internal conflict for Luke and increases the stakes, since defeating the villain would no longer be an outright victory for him. It explains why Darth Vader hasn't just straight up murdered Luke like he did to every other Jedi, and it sets up the narrative arc of the next film, where Luke's motivation is to turn his father back to the light side of the Force. Plus, it hits the audience where they live. It resonates with the story's theme of overcoming darkness. Vader failed to do that, and being Luke's father makes Vader the perfect foil for the battle between good and evil happening inside Luke. It's definitely unexpected, since we, like Luke, believe that his father was dead. And yeah, I think it's safe to say that it's pretty cool. But most importantly, it adds a wrinkle of complexity to Vader's character, where before he was a singularly focused villain, now he's conflicted between killing his son or converting him to the dark side. It's not an accident that we finally see Vader take off his mask once he resolves this internal conflict. While we're teased with glimpses of what's underneath, it's only revealed to us when Vader's at his most vulnerable, his most human. But did you notice that we still weren't told why he was in the mask and a breathing suit? We could infer it had something to do with his betrayal of the Jedi, and that symbolically, him being more machine than man was part of the price he paid for turning to the dark side. But the details didn't matter to the story, so we didn't need to know them. That's not to say we weren't curious though. Audiences who stuck around were rewarded with more details about our Wheezy friend. For instance, some of the novels that came out later hinted at the fact that Vader fell into a molten pit during a fight with Obi-Wan. But what George Lucas and co didn't count on is that audiences would be sticking around for decades to get more of Darth Vader. Eventually, you might start to answer questions that you should have left up to the audience's imagination. That leads us to the prequel trilogy, where Vader's backstory played out over 3 films. But with his arc complete at the end of the original saga, we're left with a fundamental problem. No matter how well these origin stories are executed, there's an inherent problem with jumping back in time to tell a story about Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. We've already seen the conclusion of Vader's story, and nothing we learn about him will change that. And in fact, anything you do try to change only pulls audiences out of the story, because they wonder how this change is supposed to fit with the previously established continuity. That's not to say you can't tell more stories with that character, of course. The Clone Wars TV show does an excellent job of telling self-contained stories featuring Anakin Skywalker. This might be because the show is not too concerned with chronicling Anakin's downfall, but rather telling standalone stories with new characters who will ultimately be impacted by his turn to the dark side. But the prequel trilogy was obsessed with Darth Vader's backstory. The whole saga is structured around his ascent to power and eventual downfall. While it's cool to see some of this stuff play out, the fact that the plot of the originals is set in stone means that we've knackered half of the reason for revealing Vader's backstory in the first place. Nothing shown in the prequels can affect the plot from the original films, so it becomes harder to justify showing this to the audience. Unless, of course, you make it relevant to the plot of the new films, which is exactly what the prequel trilogy did. But it also doubled down on additional lore, making Darth Vader the chosen one who would bring balance to the Force. Vader was now an immaculate conception, born through the Force to a slave mother on Tatooine. Anakin Skywalker, or rather prequel trilogy Space Jesus, then had to contend with a strict and dogmatic Jedi Council, who claimed he was too old to be a Padawan, despite the fact that he had an absolutely insane amount of midichlorians.
That's not how the Force works.
Then there's his love interest, Padme. The Jedi Council's strict code against emotional attachments meant Anakin was conflicted between his duties as a Jedi and his doomed love for Padme, opening him up to be exploited by the suspiciously evil Chancellor, who definitely wasn't a Sith Lord. Broadly speaking, it makes sense that Darth Vader's emotions would be his downfall. It's the reason we're given in the original trilogy, and in those films Vader is shown to be a pretty passionate dude. But the problem with extensively fleshing out Anakin's backstory is that for every beat that feels consistent with the original character of Darth Vader, there are others that seem almost contradictory to what we've been shown before. And that's a problem, since, as we saw earlier, really great backstory reinforces what we've already been shown, rather than contradicting it. The most obvious addition that doesn't line up is this prophecy around Vader being the chosen one. In the prequels, the prophecy is a central point of conflict between Anakin and the Jedi Council. It's the reason Qui-Gon Jinn makes Obi-Wan promise to train Anakin right before he, eats a lightsaber. It's the reason Obi-Wan is so hard on Anakin, and it's the reason the evil Lord Sidious, Chancellor Palpatine, takes such a keen interest in the young Jedi. It also makes us sympathise with Anakin as he feels the pressure of these expectations, and it resonates with the story's themes of tragic inevitability, since we as an audience already know the outcome of Anakin's tale. But what happens when you apply this to the original films? Well, obviously, this prophecy didn't exist when those films were made, so they don't reference it in any way. Like, it's the last thing Obi-Wan says to him when they duel at the end of the prequels, but they don't even mention it when they duel again on the Death Star. And if anything, it actually lowers the stakes, since Vader was predetermined to bring balance to the Force by destroying Palpatine and the Sith all along.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Never mind. But the most important thing to point out is that the purpose of Vader's backstory in those original films was to facilitate his role as the antagonist in Luke's story. This new Chosen One backstory revises all of that and makes Anakin Skywalker the ultimate main character in all of Star Wars. Ironically, expanding one character to create an entire mythology around him makes the rest of this vast world feel smaller. Whereas the original trilogy felt like this huge galaxy with various factions and worlds that could house entirely separate stories, now Darth Vader is so integral to the main events of Star Wars that his shadow looms over every tale told in that universe. Star Wars stories now can only go so long before Darth Vader inevitably shows up. But enough about the problems. Did this backstory improve his character? Was it all worth it? While you could pick apart how these changes negatively impact the plot, you'd be ignoring the biggest strength that Star Wars has always had: its ability to impact the audience. If we go back to show don't tell, the original films were great at hinting at the hero Anakin Skywalker once was, but we never actually saw Darth Vader as a good guy, aside from maybe his last couple minutes of screen time. But showing Anakin's good deeds and the relationships he had with the people around him makes the side of Darth Vader feel more real to the audience. Compare the original duel on the Death Star to some of the other scenes between him and Obi-Wan. While there's tension in this scene, the emotional impact for the audience is more about how this affects Luke, because his relationship with Obi-Wan Kenobi is the only thing we've been shown so far. But once we've spent time with Anakin and we understand the relationships he had with characters like Obi-Wan or Ahsoka, scenes like this,
Ahsoka.
Anakin.
or this,
Anakin's gone.
I'm sorry, Anakin.
have far more emotional impact. We've seen how much Obi-Wan and Ahsoka cared for Anakin, so we feel their pain at what he's become. And that's not a story you could have told without exploring who Anakin Skywalker was, because really, Anakin Skywalker is a distinctly different character from Darth Vader. While Vader is menacing and almost a force of nature, Anakin is a passionate, tortured anti-hero. New scenes with Vader tearing up the place work fine without any of that backstory, but while they're cool, they are a little one-dimensional, because they aren't really showing us anything we haven't seen of Vader before. But to show a man conflicted between the dark and light sides of the Force, and the impact that that had on the characters who cared about him, well, the original films didn't spend enough time building up Vader's good side for a story like that to work. Once we've spent time with Anakin though, we as the audience have to come to terms with how someone like this could become Darth Vader, just like Obi-Wan and Ahsoka do. This push and pull between his two identities is by far the most interesting part of his later appearances. And that's something we wouldn't get to explore without seeing more of Vader's backstory. So does Vader these days come with a mountain of lore he might have been better off without? Sure, but now that we've seen the man that Vader used to be, as an audience we can sympathise with his tragic fate in a way that we never used to be able to. And when the goal of stories should be to make the audience feel something, that's not bad at all.